All right, in 8.2, we're going to look at errors in decision making. So we've done hypothesis tests, we've made a decision of either rejecting or failed rejecting, but sometimes we make mistakes. So here we go. When we draw a conclusion from a significance test, we hope our conclusion will be correct, but sometimes it's wrong. And there's two types of errors we can make, a type 1 error and a type 2 error. All right, and here's the definitions you need to write down. A type 1 error if a test rejects the null when the null is really true. Okay? That is, the test finds convincing evidence that the alternative is true when it really isn't. A type 2 error occurs if a test fails to reject the null when the null is true, when the alternative is true. That is, the test does not find convincing evidence that the alternative is true when it really is. So how do I remember this? Well, type 2 is fails to reject. So that's how I remember that. Type 1 is just reject when we reject the null. So here's a chart that you need to complete on your notes. And it's talking you through what's going on. So if we reject the null and the alternative, because the alternative is really true, that's a correct conclusion. But if we rejected the null when the null was really true, that's a type 1 error. And there's all kinds of reasons why that can happen, but it can happen. Now, if we fail to reject the null because the null is true, that's a good, correct conclusion. That's a good thing. But if we fail to reject the null when the alternative is really true, that's a type 2 error. Okay, so the job you're going to have on these problems is to put this in context. What does that mean in this situation? What did I do? And so you just got to get your wording right and remember which one is which. Type 1 is when you rejected the null. Type 2 is when you fail to reject. Again, the memory trick I use for that is if you fail to reject, you get a type 2. Okay? So let's look at an example. You're thinking about opening a restaurant and you're searching for a good location. From your research, you know that the mean income of those living near the restaurant must be over $85,000 to support the type of upscale restaurant you wish to open. You decide to take a simple random sample of 50 people living near one potential site. Based on the mean income of the sample, you perform a test of the null where mu is 85,000 versus the alternative that the mu is greater than 85,000, where mu is the true mean income in the population of people who live near the restaurant. Now, describe a type 1 and a type 2 error. So when you're going to do this, what you need to really focus on is what is your null and what is your alternative, because you're going to put those in words. Okay, so for a type 1, remember that means I reject the null. So that means I found convincing evidence of the alternative. So to describe it, it says we found convincing evidence that the mean income population of people who live near the restaurant is less than 85,000 when it really isn't. Okay? So type 1, we rejected the null. That means we found evidence of the alternative. So we described the alternative. Because of our evidence, we think this is true, but it really isn't. Okay? So now a type 2, the opposite. Type 2 is when you failed to reject the null. So it's when we found this information, evidence for that. So we found evidence that the mean income in the population of people who live near the restaurant is 85. Found evidence that the null is true when it really isn't. Okay? So what's difficult about this is all the context shifts you have to write. Okay? You just got to remember which one you're talking about. Type 1 is when we rejected the null, we found evidence of the alternative, but it wasn't true. Type 2 is when we found evidence of the null, and it wasn't true. All right, let's try another one. So it's the same scenario about the restaurant and the mean income and people who live near it. But the question says, give a consequence of each type of error in the setting. So type 1, so remember type 1 is when we found evidence that the mean income is greater than 85,000 when it really isn't. So what happens if we make that mistake? That would mean that we build an upscale restaurant in a location where it will not be successful. Okay, so what happens if we do a type 2 error? What's the consequence of that? Well, a type 2 error means that we think their income is 85,000 when it's really more than that. Or we think it might be less than 85,000 when it's really more than that. So that would mean that we probably choose not to build that restaurant there, even though it would have been successful. The consequence is we choose not to build the restaurant in this location, even though it might have been successful. All right, so you're going to be asked to identify a type 1 error, type 2 error, and the consequences of each. So you're going to have to think a little bit, lots of context needed, but you can do it.